Well, we have a very interesting range of papers, and because, as it happens, we have only 4 papers in this session, we have a little bit more time for discussion, and we can still stay on schedule. Just one quick question first. I noticed in 2 of the papers there's mention of trips to Detroit. One can imagine that one went to Detroit because of the auto industry. But in the case of the interest in other cities, other than New York, Chicago, and here Detroit, we had Miami Beach. But what other either European cities or American cities were emblematic in shaping the thinking of these planners, whether they be in Scandinavia or in Japan or Russia?
In my specific case, Detroit was Detroit was interesting for Burov because of his project of Chelyabin car fabric, and that's why he was sent to Detroit. But he made a voyage through all United States, and he was very interested in New York, but he was very critical towards New York, and in general, the American skyscraper architecture was very interesting for Russian architects, but they rejected it. They were on the search of for other solutions, and their solutions after the war, they were, for example, this garden city and the decentralization, like in Tokyo, like in Japan, the many examples. For me, it was interesting to hear because the plan, the master plan of Tokyo, is the example for the planning of Moscow. Is also the pattern for the master plan of contemporary Moscow, not of Moscow 30, but of now. The problem of how to plan the huge city, the big city.
Well, I guess when it comes to British interwar planning and then the satellite towns afterwards, a lot of it comes back to Howard and Unwin. And I mean, Howard had traveled, actually he traveled to the US and I believe briefly attempted to be a cowboy and failed. But Unwin looked to sit in an attempt to kind of, especially coming out of World War I and trying to address modernism and try to get a handle on it. So in some ways directly rejecting what Le Corbusier did. And so the English tried to create their own model, and to a certain degree up until the early 1930s they were successful. But as the English often do, they like to live in denial. So there aren't that many influences other than, say, looking at small English towns as inspiration.
I was very interested in Marina's and your talk and the idea that how these ideas, traveled in either through traveling or by reading books. I think Aalto also was a kind of synthesizer. He didn't travel to Soviet Union, but he had many friends who worked there and actually wrote about the Soviet planning proposals in Finnish magazines. And then he came to America and traveled very widely and was very influenced. Knew Mumford, knew the TVA plans, and I think he was very fascinated by this idea that both in Soviet Union and America, that planning operated on a kind of regional level that was not hindered by political boundaries. That was this sort of logic of resources, and that of course was very well suited for the Finnish industry. That was forest industry that was by its nature decentralized rather than centralized. So I think that the influences were both, came both through kind of actual contacts and traveling, as well as kind of the dissemination of ideas through this sort of network of friends.
Well, you asked which kind of cities. I mean, I mentioned Greenbelt, Maryland, and Redburn are other examples that they took up. But what I find interesting in the Japanese case, and that starts already in the 19th century, is that they systematically pick up foreign examples. So they would send their youngsters one goes to France, one to Germany, one to Belgium, and you all bring back stuff. And that these elements that they brought back, translated, might end up one paragraph of the German building law becomes a paragraph of the Japanese building law. And so they would, just as we've seen here in urban planning, really copy out of one plan something, whether or not it fitted, into what they did. But they did what they did very systematically. Or even in the 1860s, their first trip, and half of the Japanese government went on a world tour. They went from one country to the other, observing and bringing back their findings. And that's the same thing what I find fascinating in the other papers, is the way that books influence the findings that we have, and also the way that they are interpreted by the locals, because that may not have anything to do with what the original ideas were about. And again, that leads to your point, Jean-Louis, you made about the terminology of war and how that's picked up in other countries.
Yeah, I think one very interesting story, one aspect of the war is that despite frontal oppositions, front here meets really front, information, images and concepts circulated widely. So the German planners in the General Wiederaufbaustab of Speer knew very well the British plans for London. The same was true of the Russians, who were looking at English plans, and one could say that probably the most important single model in the second part of the war is what comes out of Britain. At the same time, you have other pre-war models or pre-war concepts which are very important, the diffusion of Clarence Perry's neighborhood unit concept, of course, but one key model which we've seen, which has been mentioned briefly this morning by Schlapeter, is of course the linear city as developed by Miliutin in 1930 on the base of Soria-Imata's late 19th century concept. If we look, there are many projects almost on all sides which use the linear city concept. One is a project we had research with Hartmut when we did our project on French-German occupation architecture, which was a project for Heiligenthal in the Rhone Valley between Karlsruhe and well, there were projects by Heiligenthal, a former project by Otto and Schweitzer in this area. Czech projects use also the industrial linear city, the ones Schlapeter has shown this morning, projects by Vojenilek, and of course you have Le Corbusier's Trois établissements humains of 1945. So I would say that hegemonies are difficult to determine, that you have the one aspect which is the remote long-term effect of pre-war patterns and models. You have this sort of instant success of something like Abercrombie's Plan of London, and the slow filtration of the notions, and almost in every country this Japanese policy of shopping around for models, which is extreme there, finds a certain reflection.
Hello. Thank you, the whole panel, for such rich contributions. But Ricky Anderson, very interested in Soviet architecture. So I have some questions and comments directed towards the Karelian region and the Soviet region as well. And it relates to what I think might be called the triangular relationship between dislocation of peoples moving, dislocation of territories, geopolitical transformation, and architectural reinvention. So I was surprised to find Aalto installing a laboratory for the reconstruction of Finland at MIT, for example, which I think is quite interesting. There's another aspect to it as well, wherein as soon as the Soviet Union captures Karelia, Soviet architects go to Karelia to study Finnish architecture and bring that back to Moscow. I'm also interested in the dislocation of Soviet architects from the front to the rear to Central Asia, for example. And I'm not going to talk too much about Gurov, he's one of my favorite protagonists, but I think this experience of moving architecture to other regions becomes a rich site for rethinking how one can relate to dwelling, how one can relate to materials. And so with these, and also the other aspect was Americanism, because also there's the geopolitical transformation of the Lend-Lease agreement between America and the USSR during the war. So between Finland, for example, and the Soviet Union and America, we have a strange, collaboration with American opinion on the one hand being against Soviet Union, and then, a couple of years later signing this agreement, which enables a very interesting network of architectural research and exchange. And I was wondering if maybe the two of you or really everybody else could comment on how this dislocation and transformation is related to architectural reinvention during the war.
But I mean, first of all, because it's interesting like this, where that, at least for Aalto, the affinities, even his personal affinities in different countries kind of change in the course of time. And I think it was interesting to see also Burov that, we often look at architects in a particular period, but, they shift and change their ideas and affinities, and Aalto was certainly a case. So he, the moment that, of course, he gets in contact with America is connected to these geopolitical events. In fact, he comes to America. He's kind of picked up by the MoMA in 1937 in the Paris Fair, because, of course, there was there were no other modern masters almost around. So he becomes the figure in this particular geopolitical context. So he's brought to America, and then, of course, by that time, like I said, that's where Finnish economy, his major client, had its main investment, and so it's not like by chance that it was not for kind of ideological reasons, but it was this sort of momentum that had to do with these geopolitical shifts. He didn't come here to study, but it was more like he was kind of combination of own will and happenstance and geopolitical events that led him to America, this very long connection with America during the war. Of course, not least because I don't think he was too keen on having his family in Finland at the time. And then this interesting Karelian architecture, there's a little piece that he wrote about Karelian architecture at this same time, where he celebrates the Karelian vernacular for being this sort of organic, malleable, kind of embryonic house type. And that was also interesting because he in his early articles, he showed no interest in Finnish vernacular architect. He was very much kind of an urban, modern man, much more drawn to other countries and to metropolitan regions than to Finnish. So it also, that particular interest, had to do with that. That momentum of the war.
And then it can come.
I think it's a very important question. It's a very important topic during all the conference, the network of architects and the exchange took part during all the time. But I mean that my case, maybe it's an exception, because there were virtually no contacts before 43 and 44, and it was only the short time when it was allowed. There were contacts to international constructivists and many architects during the 20s and in the beginning of the 30s, but not afterward, and not after the end of the war, with the beginning of the Cold War, and in the decrees, architectural decrees, was said no foreign solutions and not use the foreign magazines. And it's very important question. Where came this idea? What were the sources for Burov, for example, to know about all the things he knew, architecture forum, or maybe some magazines, but it was extremely difficult. But Lend-Lease and the exchange of goods, it was very important during the wars. And I must say that the exchange with Karelia, it's not exchange, but me personally, I live in the Finnish house in Moscow. I have a Finnish house. The house that was brought from Finland during the war in the suburb of Moscow. There were many houses, and they were constructed there from the Finnish materials. It's really Finnish house. It was a gift of Stalin to the writers in the writers' settlement in the Soviet Union. Such contacts, but strange. But there were no contacts in the 50s, in the 60s, and it's a very difficult situation. And sending architecture to Middle Asia, yes, but the examples for this, it was Moscow and the big cities, and all the cities all around the Soviet Union, from Yerevan to Tashkent, were built after this example, with this parade avenues and Stalinistic architecture with a little bit vernacular accent. So much to exchange.
Paul, where's the microphone? Paul Jasper.
We're recording everything, and this will be retained against you.
Oh, okay, well, so Paul Jaskin, Carola Hein, just a quick question actually, following back up on this idea of kind of precedents and things. I mean, it seems to me, I'm interested in your last point. I wanted you to explain a little bit more about the kind of visibility of the war in Hiroshima and the invisibility of the war in Tokyo. I thought that was really fascinating, and since it picks up with some themes today, I thought maybe we could hear a little bit more about that. It did seem that Ishikawa's interest in planning, I didn't see Feder, I saw, if you'll forgive my vulgar regionalism, Burnham. I mean, I'm thinking the Burnham Plan, I'm thinking 19th century. So it does seem a kind of canonical, even abstract relationship to planning. And did that get translated in Tokyo? They just avoided the question of the fire bombings, or they just wanted to kind of think about only planning in a kind of abstract, technocratic way, and that was that? Where was the war? I guess that's the question.
Right. So basically, to the two questions, you have to see it in the picture of 215 cities having been bombed. And there's only two where special financing is awarded. These are Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And they have to go through the Allied government to even request this special funding to be allowed to hold an international competition in Hiroshima, to be allowed to do this kind of land readjustment. There is no other funding around. I mean, if you look at Tokyo, the first materials that come in go into military huts for the Allied forces. There is no reconstruction money there. So, and you have to see that also in the face of how Tokyo was traditionally rebuilt. The city was used to fires, earthquakes, typhoons, destroying the city. Fires were called the flowers of Edo, the flowers of Tokyo, so they were so regularly there. Shopkeepers were supposed to be back in business after 3 days, otherwise you didn't even bother to come back. Big mansions would have, big daimyo families might have 3 sites. If the first one burned down, they moved to the second and had the building materials on the third to rebuild the first. So rebuilding was a habit, and it went so fast. And when you looked even at not in so much in my slide, but in the slide this morning, you will have the rebuilding already around the Peace Center, the memorial building in Hiroshima, while the building is going up. The city had lost half of its population. They expected nobody would want to move back in there. But the people came streaming back from the colonies. People moved into Hiroshima, and the sites were built with slums. It was a real act of force to keep this land empty, and forced through this proposal for the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Hall. In Tokyo, no such thing happened. People were just rebuilding as fast as they could. They did a minimum in land readjustment, widening some streets to allow for circulation to get through. But still today in Tokyo, you have 75% of the streets that are less than 4 meters, so 12 feet wide. So that's tiny. And usually you're not allowed to rebuild on a street that's so tiny. They also have a habit of saying if you have a line on a building line on paper, that works in reality. So even if the street is not there, you can pretty much rebuild as long as the line is on paper. So there's all kinds of traditions where they imported words from the West, terms from the West that they never applied. So I would say that the pressure was so high on reconstruction that it just didn't happen. And there was no real attempt to do it. I don't think that this identification with memorials, and that's the other side to your question, is as high. So after the, and remember Tokyo in 1923 had just lost 100,000 people, was completely destroyed. I mean, the city had just been, what, 20 years old. And for that event, they only had set up one pagoda in remembrance. So there's no real tradition of having that kind of memorials around. So the only memorials you might have some, you have a little exhibit in the town hall. You have, I find it a ridiculous little park. Well, it's okay, but sort of concrete blocks that look more like a destroyed European city that's supposed to be a reminder of the war destruction. But the main memorial in Tokyo is probably the Yasukuni Shrine. And the Yasukuni Shrine it's a shrine to all the war dead. But it's a hugely debated piece of religious architecture, because included in this group of dead are, what do you call them, war criminal class A people. And so if the prime minister goes there to honor the war dead, he automatically honors those criminals. And each time the prime minister goes there, there's a whole outcry all over Asia. So by sort of deconcentrating the memorial function, they did the people a service in rebuilding their identity, and they got it away from the focal point of politics and economics. So Tokyo could rebuild, Japan could rebuild itself around about the notion of being an economic power rather than the place where the war started. The other thing is, in terms of FEDA, I think the way the plan is designed, the Japanese didn't care about that. What they looked at was that he calculated how many bakeries do you need for a neighborhood of so and so many people, how many hairdressers, how many. It's really a how-to-do kit, city building for dummies kind of book, where you want to have this approach into building. And the aesthetic part, they didn't care about it. That they shooed away. In general. Does that? Okay.
What's the role of the book if they basically ignore it?
No, they.
I mean, does it have any impact really if the tradition is just to rebuild? Is it a kind of paper exercise for students?
Well, in 10, 15 textbooks, you will see this relationship between Howard, Perry, FEDA, and the name comes up. Every planner that you talk to would know this name, and they usually would cite FEDA as an example to build a new town. So even Takayama Eka, the one who did the Datong plan, when I talked to him, referred to the book. They may not exactly know what's in it anymore, but it's the paragraph they have studied in their textbooks, and they could not talk to any European or American planner because nobody would put Howard and FEDA into the same box, onto the same page of a textbook. So it's really important to them, even if they don't clearly understand what's going on, but in terms of the shopping around, that's pretty much what they've done over time with many other examples.
Please introduce yourself.
Oh, my name is Carol Kridsky. I teach downtown at NYU. This is a remark, not a question, but the subject of New York City as a potential model has come up several times in passing. And the fascination existed with the skyscraper, but people didn't do them. There were fairly low high-rise buildings here and there between the wars, but not really big ones. And one of the reasons for that is apparently the differences in the building process. In the United States, there is a different organization of architects vis-a-vis the engineers vis-a-vis the city planners than there is in other countries. And I know this from England. I can't be very specific at the moment because I didn't bring my notes on the subject. But part of the problem is that people don't build in the same way in European countries or with the same building organization. The other problem is that many countries were fascinated by skyscrapers but lacked sufficient steel in order to build them. There simply weren't those physical resources, and we have the iron, the coal, the transportation, etc., plus the building experience. The low high-rises abroad seem normally to have grown to the height of one elevator course. After a while, an elevator doesn't just go straight up. It has to stop, and you have to have another bank of elevators or some other apparatus. And in Europe, they seem not to have gone beyond one elevator stroke, you might say.
My name is Juan Blanco. I'm an architect. I am also a city historian. My work is basically in Luso-Hispanic America. My question, in a sense, goes back to the one that was made by Mary McLeod before the last question. And I'd like to flip it on its head. Less so much as the happy advancement of modern urbanism around the world, but rather the effect of adopting the norms and normatives of urbanism from other places has on the viability of traditional construction, even when that is what people essentially do. My experience of looking at the part of the world that I'm more familiar with is that that has a negative effect in the sense that it confuses and delegitimates historical processes of construction that, although they may not be well known on a conscious level by the so-called intelligentsia, still are known by society at large. And if we compare, for instance, this to the observations of someone like Gramsci on culture of politics, as a sort of language, there are transmissions and there are resistances, and that's a very interesting interface in this question worldwide in terms of the introduction of the modern, where in fact one has ample and varied continuities in so-called traditional architectural practices, traditional construction, and there is a sense of loss in terms of the viability overall after a while by the instigation of the overthrow of traditional construction consciousness on an institutional level. By that I mean all the factors that are involved in construction at large by ostensive, formal rules of, that would seem to regulate, but in fact do not. So you end up having an architecture that really isn't anything like traditional architecture. It isn't modeled either. It's sort of like a bastard copy of both. It's a challenge.
I think one of the problems that the British had was up until the early 30s, they thought they were the leaders. And they thought they had come up with this great way of bringing what they considered to be modern and their traditional architecture and merge it together. And then suddenly it was almost like they woke up one day and discovered that there were these Europeans who were doing really exciting things that they had kind of ignored or considered it was just a kind of a trivial 19th century obsession with machinery. After World War II, that traditional architecture was, while not completely dismissed, for government housing was largely abandoned. And one of the challenges that the British had was they had seen this stuff, but they didn't necessarily know how to do it right, which means that, one, you have a building trade that's forced to adapt to something that they don't understand, and as a result, you start having buildings falling apart 15 and 20 years later. And it's only in the 1960s that when, I mean, if you've had to live in a really small space and then you're given the opportunity to have a front yard and a backyard, and then your kids have that taken away and they're stuck in a really small space, even though it may have the amenities that you didn't have before, you still feel like you've lost something. And this is something that the British, to a certain degree, continued to grapple with, because, I mean, there are wonderful examples of high modernism, but there are also really bad copies because people don't understand, or the tenants who are living there don't want to be there.
one short point which was triggered by Marina's remarks on the barracks. In the and she used also a term which no one in the audience could understand, but maybe all the Russian speakers here, the notion of Khrushcheva to describe the buildings built under Khrushchev. It's a sort of compression of two terms: Khrushchev, the name of a leader, and Trushoba, which means slum. It could be called slum chefs or something like that. But there were also other terms which were used to mark the Stalinist, the architecture of Stalinist time. One was and there were stylistic descriptions, late repressions, repression and Renaissance, and also neo-barocco, from Baroque and Baroque. And this is what I want to allude to. I think there is, in this wartime and immediate post-war construction, there is also, I mean, we're working, or I've been trying to identify a series of polar oppositions. So extreme visibility, invisibility, for instance. Another one is probably high and low, sophisticated architecture and refined programs, and also what was basically the residential condition of people in underground spaces, in shacks, in huts, etc. So from this point of view, I think one of the most important wartime experiences is certainly, if we look from the side of tens of millions of populations engaged in the war, from Japanese bombed city to Russian factory housing in the steppes to American workers on the Willow Run site, like we saw yesterday, is really precarious housing. If there is a real figure of wartime architecture, it is probably the ramshackle hut, which will in some case survive and to practically to this day in cities I know. So there is also a sort of subtext, which is this sometimes elaboratedly designed architecture, but sometimes completely serial and automatic architecture of huts.
Tim Benton, I'd like to comment a little bit on the account of the developments in Britain, if I might. I think you have to distinguish between the development of modern planning. You talked about two things, the planning and housing. Mm-hmm. And I think you have to separate them out a little bit. For a start, in the planning legislation in the 30s, the Greenwood Act started a number of acts which institutionalized planning. So the Abercrombie Plan was one of plans for a number of cities, Birmingham, Manchester, and so forth. They were all supposed to do plans, urban plans. And those were, as everybody has said, considered state-of-the-art. They were very good plans. All of them were very good plans. They adopted many of the best ideas from European modern urban planning and so forth. The thing you could make two kind of contradictory remarks about what happened after the war. One was the savage and intense and quick way in which all that expertise was dropped in planning terms. Plymouth, we saw a plan of Plymouth, for example. Plymouth is just one of a number of cities in Britain that were destroyed by planners after the war, that had cities driven through the centre of them like stakes. Birmingham is a big example, Plymouth, Exeter, Coventry, one after another, these cities, these bombed cities, were destroyed by planners, making it very difficult to do anything, housing or anything else afterwards, and not at all in the line of this planning tradition that had been nurtured in the 30s and developed into the Abercrombie and other similar plans. On the other hand, you could say, by contrast, that in housing terms, the majority housing types in the 50s were not the tower blocks. That's a 60s phenomenon. The two things were, the semi-detached house went on being built exactly as before with slightly cheaper materials and slightly smaller gardens. That was the main housing stock. And the second most important, the modern version of that, was the maisonette. The 4-story maisonette was the main form of housing in Britain until the politicians got involved and you had the housing wars, where the Conservative and Labour governments pumped money into election pledges to build 300,000, 500,000 houses a year, and so forth, none of which quite happened. And it was then that the system building came in, and that the tower blocks came in, and all the things that you described about poor construction and so forth really began to make an impact. But if you don't run the story beyond, say, 1955, a lot of the things that you were describing, it seemed to me, don't happen yet.
Well, part of that is the fact that I'm limited by time, and there's only so much I can do. A number of the early tower blocks that you see appearing in some of in and around London are appearing in 54, 55, 56, and 57. No, that's true. Those are the early ones. And by 1957, 3/4 of new city housing in Birmingham is in multi-story flats. And you're correct that that politicians increasingly threw stuff out because they had to compete. One thing that I found interesting in my research when I started doing it, I had kind of thought of flats as being more of a socialist labor type of thing. But in fact, in my reading in Birmingham, the Labour Party actually preferred the more Garden City aesthetic, and that it was actually a Conservative Party that pushed the tower blocks more and multi-story flats because it hurt the construction unions, and it allowed for more work for unskilled laborers. So your comments are very valid, and trust me, there was more damage done in the 60s. So I can't argue on that. Sure.
How many more? One more question? Yes. Okay, one more question.
May
No?
I?
Yes. Okay, please.
Okay, thank you. My name is Andrea Urushima from Kyoto University, and I would like to add a remark to the discussion they had before about the question of a war in city and the absence of memorials in Japanese cities. I have the feeling that, in fact, for Japanese, they want to forget the war. And so it is intentional to rebuild it fast and just go back to normal life and finish with an episode of history that was so passionately undertaken by the whole nation and that failed. Whole nation, including architects and planners. And one evidence of it is that it's very hard to find in the histories of architectures analysis that link directly the work of architects and planners during the war period or in colonies. And in fact, if you touch on those topics in front of Japanese professors, they will get really angry. So I don't think it is just not intentional in this case.
No, I agree. I mean, there is no, to add on to your point, even when I first went over and I wanted to look at visions for rebuilding, I mean, that was the goal when I first studied there. And most of the architects just told me we didn't have any visions. If we did anything, then we counted bombing holes. But we didn't know, they had never had a war on their soil. They had no idea how the war would end. Germany had been in a very different situation. So there were really only, between Ishikawa, Nishiyama, Tange, and I mean 2 or 3 others, nobody else really dared even think about the end of war. I mean, that's another part that goes hand in hand with. But I agree, I mean, another part of it may be that the Japanese in general don't attach similar values, I would argue, to buildings or memorials as in the West. So if you think about Tokyo Tower, there's nobody that would say, oh, I'm like a Parisian might say, I'm back home, I've seen the Eiffel Tower, and I don't know if any of the Parisians would say that, but you have sort of buildings that you're attached to when you return to a European city. Tokyo Tower doesn't have any meaning of that. And the meaning at all, if there's any meaning, I'd say, in terms of buildings, it's more attached on the neighborhood level. It may be your neighborhood shrine, or it may be your neighborhood main street, but there's no concept, I think, about or identification with the city as a whole or with specific buildings. And the turnover of buildings is also way too fast. I mean, today I think we're still talking about 15 years as a lifespan.
Rebuild what was before the war, what was left from plans from before the war. So I have the feeling they were trying to forget, just go back to what happened before and forget it.
Right.
This is my feeling anyway. I don't have
and the fact that the emperor was still in charge after the war, that he hadn't disappeared, sort of meant that there was a continuity to be held.
So I think this session, like the others, has shown that all of these topics tend to explode the time frame for this conference of World War II. The papers have dealt with the construction of housing as a long-term problem, as an emergency problem, with the mitigation of damage from air raids, with symbolic representation, both in cities and in buildings, be that imperial or memorial or national in form. There's been consideration of architectural style, be it modernist or vernacular or other kinds of forms, transnational flow of ideas and persons, monumentality, the universalist claims of architects and planners to be able to reshape their societies as they would wish to do so, the dialectical relationship between political authorities and architects and planners, and of course we've also talked a lot about failures, that is to say the plans which were never realized, the buildings which were not built. We've all treated this as a largely synchronic kind of phenomenon, acting as if World War II and even the years before and after it are part of a single period. But any historian will point out that the war is different in every place, whether there was actual combat, whether there was bombing, when these things actually happened. And I think it still remains for all of us a attempt to go beyond a synchronic vision of this period and try to add a diachronic and make this somewhat more complex in order to see how these relationships differ in different places and in different times and how these things fit together. One of the wonderful things about a conference like this, particularly this one, is it always helps to have at least one person in the room who has an absolutely encyclopedic knowledge of everything. And that, of course, is Jean-Louis, who can speak, whether it's Geddes in Texas to Russia to Italy to wherever. And we can all envy him, certainly I do, for his vast knowledge. He was sort of waving a little bit, so I'd like to see if you want to make one remark before we move to our last.
No, I don't think we need any more remarks other than the remarks of Joan, who has patiently listened to everybody during these 2 days. So I will just give her the mic for her final comments.